Oh, wow. I remember that music. It's been a minute.
It sure has. It sure has.
Wow. Good
It sure
afternoon,
has.
sir. Happy Sabbath to you, my
Happy
friend.
Sabbath to you. Happy Sabbath to you. So good. I mean, I felt like I was ostracized. I didn't know where y'all were. I didn't know what was going on. What's
Oh,
going
don't
on?
blame that on us. Don't put that on us. We didn't know where you were
Ah.
too, brother, through all of that. But listen, it is good to see you. And we're still missing somebody today, man.
Yeah, yeah. This week, I think he's celebrating his anniversary with his bride,
Oh, that's a
and
good
he
miss
told
then.
us, yeah, he told us, y'all gonna have to do this without us.
Yeah,
So
that's
we
that's a
wish him
good
all the
miss.
best. Yes,
I
yes, we wish him
understand
all the
that Dr.
best.
Henry is with his. Can I put the number out there? Is that all right? I think
Yeah,
he's all
be
right with
careful.
that.
Hey, yeah. Well, you
It's
can't do
it,
nothing about it now.
That's right. That's right. Unless he shows up in the chat. The 25th anniversary for Dr. Dion Henry
Yes,
and his wife. We
yes.
want to show him some love in the chat today. So, a big congratulations to them, our colleague, our co host. What a joy that is. I know that they are somewhere traipsing around Europe right now on that 25th year anniversary. So, Dr. Henry, man, we are proud of you. We're excited for you and for your wife, and we know that God has blessed your marriage and your ministry, and what a powerful testimony that is. So, thank you for the example that you and your wife lead for the rest of us. Appreciate you, man. Thank you
Yes,
so much.
yes, 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 yes. Some of you are probably wondering, where is he? Where you know the game? Where's Waldo? They're probably trying to figure, where is Wade today? Where is Wade today? Well,
Yeah,
I
because that
have the
background.
privilege. It's not the norm. I have the privilege of attending a young man I mentored and baptized, and he is graduating from Union Springs Academy. And so I came, I made the trek all the way from Nashville up to Union Springs, New York. And we are here. We couldn't miss the show, so we pulled away in a little corner. We're just so proud of Justin Dory Miller, Thomas
Good.
Miller, as he graduates from high school. And guess where he's coming? I gave it away. He is
Oakwood
coming.
University.
There you go. You go. Go Oakwood. Go Oakwood.
Oakwood.
Yeah,
I
he
almost
is.
look like the
He
colors in
is.
the tie that you're wearing. That blue and
Yeah,
gold.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. He's coming to Oakwood, so we're excited about
that's
that. He'll be a
awesome.
little closer to me, and he's excited about that. So congratulate, and his whole tribe is here. Half the
Oh
church
wow.
is just for Justin. I'm surprised. He is so shocked. The rest of the church are other members of the graduating class, but Justin has a good showing of folks who came up to support him. So we praise God for that.
That's good stuff. Good stuff. Well, man, I got to shout out my people. Then my
Mm.
my church has a church school, and we had graduation for our eighth graders. We had graduation for our kindergartners. We had graduation for our learning center as well, and just how proud we are of all of those kids. And I know all
Mm.
across the
Mm.
country, it's graduation season, and so for so many graduates out there at every different level, from the pastors roundtable, we just want to say a big congratulations to you and to your families. We know the
Yes.
hard work and effort and energy that goes into that, the money, the resources, the sweat and the tears, all
Yes.
of that. So we just want you to know that we appreciate the accomplishments, and we celebrate the accomplishments that you guys have been brought to in this season of your life. And we know that God has some great things ahead of you. I went to our academy graduation down here in Miami Union Academy last week. We had some of our students from my church, A New Hope, walked away with the valedictorian, over
Come
70
on.
something $1,000 in scholarships from
Ooh.
just one school,
Ooh.
from Oakwood.
Ooh.
And then just all of our students together, we were so proud of. I think we walked away with almost $300,000+ worth of scholarships between, I think, the four students that represented our little
Nice.
church down here in Fort Lauderdale. So
Nice.
big
Nice.
shout out
Nice.
to our educational team and what God is doing in those parents and in those homes. So great stuff, great stuff, great stuff.
Praise God. Praise God. Praise God. Listen, we
All right.
serve a mighty God. We serve a mighty God that provides resources for his children. and
Yeah.
our education system is one of those. So we give God praise for that.
Hey, I
Look,
saw it firsthand.
we
Christian education actually pays. It actually did in that scenario. So praise God,
There
man.
you go. There you go. There you go. Listen, we could talk all day, but we got
Yes.
two powerful guests here. We had some technical difficulties the last couple of weeks. Not only just technical difficulties, just
Logistical.
scheduling and things like
Yeah.
that, logistical issues. But today we are just so glad to have one of our episodes dealing with conflict and the system, or conflict and policy, and so we are hoping to have conversations throughout this season that deals with this conflict situation. But today we are going to have a conversation on conflict of interest.
Oh my.
Conflict of interest. Normally, when we talk about this on the board, it's sometimes just glossed over. But today we want to delve into it because it's becoming a very important issue among our clergy, among our churches, and so we're just so glad to have that conversation today. Pastor Paul, tell us who's at the table today.
Man, we are excited today to have both of our guests, our alumnus. Is that all right? Is that the right form of the word?
PRT
Alumnus
alums.
of the PRT. They have both been with us before, and we are excited to have back with us. Man, I'm going to slaughter our first guest last name. So I'm just going to go with his first name, and I'm going to have him pronounce it for us again when he gets on the last name. I know he's used to that, but Karnik, I'm going to take a stab at it. Doukmetzian, and he's going to fix it when he gets on there. But we are happy to have him. He is the general counsel for the North American division, as well as the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And he is, from what I understand, he has had a whole lot to do with creating the policy, at least at the NAD level, for conflict of interest. So we are really excited to have him on the program with us today and to join this discussion. He is joined by our second guest, who is Elder Jason Tracey. He is also a lawyer. He works in the South Florida area. I've had lots of interaction with Jason Tracey over the years. He has worked for the State Department, well, he'll tell us all that specifics. He's worked for the state. He's also worked in private practice as well. And so we are excited that they both bring a wealth of experience and a wealth of information, both in the corporate sector as well as in some of the private sectors, as it pertains to this particular issue. This is an issue, and I'll start it off now. I know we said we could get to it later, but people are thinking, many people may be wondering, why are y'all talking about conflict of interest? What's that got to do with anything that I've got anything to do with? Some of you may not know that when you are a part of your local church board, that at the beginning, there's a conflict of interest document that all of our board members at our local church are asked to sign and to agree to. All of our employees are asked to sign and agree to that. And so we wanted to dig a little deeper into that today. And so we are excited to have both of these gentlemen with such a wealth of experience to come and to share with us on the topic today. There may be some misunderstandings. We would like to bring clarity to some of the issues. So we're excited to have them. And they're going to tell us just a little bit more about where they are, what they're doing as they come on. And there they are. I told Karnik as he came on, I felt so underdressed. I wasn't having a bow tie on today, and it looked so scholarly. But listen, gentlemen, we are excited to have both of you with us today. Thank you so much for sharing with your time once again here at the Pastors Roundtable. I know, Karnik, you were with us some time ago when we talked about your rights as a member. What are your rights as a member? I think that was in season 3 or season 4, something like that. And then Jason Tracey, you were with us when we talked about
safety.
Yes, safety, like
Yeah.
something had to do with gun violence or something like that.
Gun violence and
Yeah. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you again for being with us today. We're going to give you in just a moment an opportunity to greet our audience and guests as normal. But just before we do that, we'd like to just offer a word of prayer. And then we will give you just a few minutes here to say hello to our audience and let us know a little bit more detail about where you are, what you're doing, and what that entails. But let's pray. Father, we pray that as we engage this conversation today, that it would be one that in the end would simply give honor and glory to you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
All right. Well, let's start from left to right, or at least on my screen. Let's start with Karnik, and yeah, help me out, Karnik, again with that pronunciation, man. I know I slaughtered it, but help us out here. Pronounce that for me again.
Well, it's not as easy as Paul, but it's close. The last name is Doukmetzian. It is of Armenian origin, but it traces back my roots to Armenia. I was born in Greece with parents who survived the Holocaust, the murder of the Armenians by the Turks in the 1920s. So yeah, I grew up in Greece and emigrated to Canada as a refugee when I was young, and have eventually made my way down to the U.S. the last 25, 26 years, and have been at the General Conference now those years.
Wow, that's fascinating. And at the General Conference, just give us a little bit of an overview of the scope of your role and your duties there. Help our audience just get a better understanding and view of what you do there.
Certainly. I am the General Counsel of the General Conference and the North American Division. We have a staff of 6 lawyers that assist me as associates who oversee various aspects of the legal work of the church. And we provide those services to various entities of the church in North America as well as overseas, depending on their needs, from tax to immigration to contracts to Sabbath accommodation, litigation, anything that any large organization, corporation is involved with, the church is also involved with. We're not that different than any other organization.
Okay, so as soon as Sabbath is over, I'm going to call you about that ding I found on my car door after church parking lot plan. All right. Thank you so much for that, Karnik. Jason, give us a little update, man. The time is yours to say hello to anybody you want to say hello to, or just tell us just a little bit about the scope of where you are, what you're doing as we get into our program today.
Certainly. You would notice, Karnik, you didn't pronounce my name at all, my last name either. You for a loop at times, I know. But no, it's a pleasure to be here. As you said earlier, I've been with you gentlemen before. I've watched you just over and over again, and truly excited to be here this afternoon. Season 7, I can't believe it. It just feels so fresh, but the content's been just full of substance throughout the time. So I really appreciate that. I am currently the chief legal officer for a nonprofit organization that has and handles a contract for foster youth. Those are youth who've been abandoned, abused, and neglected. And so the state has taken those children as dependent upon the state and provide services for them. So I head out the legal department in 2 different circuits and just kind of manage and make sure that those youth's needs are being met as best as possible. You're not going to be able to meet all their needs. Unfortunately, they're taken away from their families, and oftentimes they show up with a garbage bag of items or nothing. And so we kind of work through that. But prior to that, I was a trial attorney for the local county here, did that for a while, and also worked in the public sector as a white-collar crime prosecutor. And then I could go down the list of other things I've done, but more importantly, I serve the church and grateful to do so. I've had the opportunity to work with a various amount of pastors in my time, Pastor Paul being one of them. And I currently serve the Southeastern Conference at large on the executive committee as well, and have an opportunity to just serve in that capacity and hopefully do what God will be pleased with when it's all said and done. So just enjoying my time this afternoon with you gentlemen.
All right. Good stuff. Good stuff. Again, delighted to have both of you here. And so we're just going to go ahead and jump into our discussion today. And I'd like to start, Elder Tracey, with you. if you just kind of give us just an overview in a general sense of the term conflict of interest. What does it mean in a general sense? I know some people aren't particularly familiar with it. I know a lot of HR departments may be familiar with it, but sometimes just your ordinary individual who doesn't have to do a lot with administration or governance in their organization may not really come into contact with the term. So if you could just give us just an overview, a general overview of what that means in the marketplace.
So industry standard term used, you're absolutely right. It's used in many different respects. And I think generally you kind of look at it and you examine it from the standpoint of a conflict of interest being defined as a situation in which a person, a personal interest or of an individual or an organizational um, may have a adverse effect on a duty that is owed in making a decision for the benefit of a third party. So you can have perhaps whether it be an employee, a volunteer, committee, or board member, in our instance we're talking about here, that's responsible for making a decision and on behalf of the church can possibly be a risk at making a decision if it's not viewed as being transparent or being fair because of a personal interest or a personal objective that could possibly be perceived in making or the outcome of that other decision. So it's just the idea of someone analyzing whether it could possibly be a bias as it relates to your involvement in that group or that particular decision. And you have various types. You have a financial conflict potentially. You could possibly have a personal conflict. And you could also have what's called a loyalty conflict. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later as it relates to the idea of conflict of commitment, which is a little bit different, but falls under the same umbrella of the conflict of interest.
Okay, awesome. And by the way, to our audience that's watching today, we invite your questions and comments along the way as well. Unfortunately, for today, my system is not where I cannot see your questions or things that come through, but I'm pretty sure Roger can, and so he can pull those on if they come. But Karnik, I'd like to give you a follow-up to that question as well. I have pastored in my career. I've pastored a lot of tiny churches. Like, right, when we start off pastoring, we got these little small churches. And oftentimes it will come up that if you've got two relatives who sit on a church board, I almost invariably I will get somebody will say to me, "Oh, well, they can't be on the board at the same time, can they? Because that is a conflict of interest if two family members are sitting on the board." That's one of the common things that we see. Is that in fact a conflict of interest, or does it create an environment to ask the question, or is that just kind of people are just saying it just because they think they might get outvoted on an issue or something? How does that roll?
Well, it's probably a misunderstanding of what the concept of conflict of interest is all about. Regardless of whether we sit on a church board, the board of Microsoft, McDonald's, or a conference committee or union committee, regardless of where we sit, we have fiduciary responsibilities. As members of that board, of that church board, conference committee, whatever it happens to be, we have fiduciary obligations. And one of those obligations is that for us to act in the best interests of the organization. So when we're taking action, when we're making decisions, we have to act in the best interests of that organization. So what that means is we have to subordinate our personal interests to those of the organization, to be loyal to the organization. So when an issue comes up for a vote, say on the church board, we have to make a decision as we sit on that church board that is in the best interests of the church. Now, can a husband and wife get into a conflict over that decision? It may be something they have to discuss when they get home, but as far as their service on the board, as long as they're acting in the best interests of the board, of the church, then there is no conflict. If they start to receive a personal benefit from that decision, that's when the conflict arises.
So it's not just that we can't have them on the board because we might get outvoted. They might stack the votes against us. It's if those votes are bent towards them receiving some sort of a personal benefit or interest in that particular vote.
Or if they're voting in a way that is contrary to the best interests of the organization of the board. Let me give you an
Got it.
example.
Wow.
Let's
Okay.
say that the church budget comes up for a vote, and the treasurer has presented a budget that is so far overboard that the church is going to be in a deficit position, thinking that, okay, somebody's going to give us a big offering. But the responsible board member, regardless of whether they're married or not, sitting on that board is going to question that and say, am I voting this budget, and is it going to be in the best interest of the church? If I vote a budget, if I vote an expenditure that is going to put the church into a deficit, is that beneficial to the church, or is that opposed to the interests of the church? That's the
Mm,
concept I have to think through.
mm,
Got
mm.
it. Got it.
Attorney Tracey, as you were sharing information as to what in general terms, the phrase conflict of interest, I actually began to think back over the years of my participation in church, in participating in church business, in participating in community business, and I began to realize that some of us approach being part of something from a very personal position. I've not heard it really talked about being that you are there representing the organization. Even at our constituency meetings, a lot of our delegates to the constituency meeting feel that they are there because they are representing their local church. And I could be wrong on that. Am I wrong on that? That your participation in the meeting is for the benefit of the organization at large and not your particular position in the church or group that you participate with, or even the local church when it comes to like constituents. Am I wrong in that thinking?
No, not at all. I actually heard Karnik speak to this, and Karnik, I don't want to speak for you, but as you talked about those individuals who are sitting on that church board, the idea is it goes beyond you. So as you're
Mm,
being asked to serve in that capacity, at that moment, you sideline your interests, you sideline your objectives, if you will, and you remove the biases as it relates to how it will impact you, and you start to do an analysis as to how it will impact the organization. And so as we go up, and the beautiful thing about our church structure is it does have layers, right? And so it kind of goes up, we just fall into this umbrella. And so as you're going up from one level to the next, you are in fact representing on that level on behalf of those who have actually called and asked you to serve in that capacity, but for the greater good of the organization. And so
mm,
there are times where you're serving it for the benefit of the organization, and it may rub you the wrong way. Simple things,
mm,
some you may not like the stylistic aspect of what is being presented, but as it relates to the church overall, this is for the benefit of the organization. And to have those things not come into conflict, it can be very difficult. You could be at war with yourself. But that's where prayer comes in, and the what does Paul say? Denying self, right? John the Baptist
mm,
about the idea of decreasing so that Christ can increase. Those are principles that are
mm.
not applicable during the 11 o'clock worship hour, but they are applicable to our
Come on.
lives.
Yeah. Raj, I
I
think that was a great question, a great follow-up, but I'm going to push back a little bit on the question itself, in the sense of, so I could look at, if I am sitting on a committee, or if an individual is sitting on a committee that says represents a union, right? Like a union committee, but they're coming from a specific conference. And so that individual who's on that committee, then the question remains, are they there representing just the union as a whole and not their individual conference? And we can apply this to even a local conference, and say, well, what about my local church? Now, is that different? And I would like to pose this to our guest. If that individual is there and they are speaking to the needs or the concerns of their particular constituency at that particular table, in that context, at a union meeting or a division meeting or a GC meeting, does that constitute a conflict of interest because they are there speaking to the concerns that they believe their field has back home, is that different from a personal interest? Like, I'm going to personally benefit from this decision, as opposed to this other arm or this other leg or facet of the same denomination is still going to benefit from whatever it is I'm trying to advocate for or to push at this level. Are those two separate things? The personal advocation as for something that's going to personally benefit them, or is it also conflict if they are speaking towards a concern for the particularly augment or segment of the organization that they represent?
It is a conflict, period. Uh,
That's a
regardless of
conflict.
regardless of what board you're sitting on, you have to take actions that are beneficial to that particular organization. So if you're sitting on the executive committee of the union, for example, and a request comes in from your conference for a $10 million subsidy, you may be very much in favor of that request. But when you're sitting on the executive committee of the union, you have to make a decision based on what is in the best interests of the union. And the union may not have $10 million to give to your local conference. You can't vote in favor of that action because you have to vote in a way that is in the best interests of the union on that board on which you're currently serving. Now, when you go back to your conference, you may very well have a different action that you're going to take. But when you're serving on the executive committee of the union and that action comes forward, you have to take that action that is in the best interests of the union.
Okay, so let me make it a little bit more dicey there. So it's not just $10 million for my conference. It's $10 million that will go to either conference A or to conference B. and I'm there from conference B. And so if I vote for that or if I advocate for that, is that a conflict of interest? Or is that one of those votes that everybody from that conference should just recuse themselves from?
Well, advocating and voting are a little different. You can advocate a position as long as you're not personally benefiting from that action.
Okay.
But ultimately, when it comes time to take the vote, you're going to have to look at the financial situation of the organization on whose board you're serving, and make sure that that decision meets the best interest test of that organization.
Got it. Elder Tracey, anything to add
Wow.
to that?
Yeah, I think that the idea that you're advocating on behalf of the conference and then voting however you're voting, I think we have to be vigilant as it relates to the conflict of interest. It's all about notice and disclosure. And I think that as you're signing those forms, individuals are knowing that Jason Tracey is coming and he's sitting on this particular body as a representative from this particular conference. And so there's no bones about it as it relates to how he's going to potentially, most likely, advocate and most likely vote as well. And so I think part of that discussion for me, where you talk about making it dicey, I think it rubs against the idea of notice and disclosure. And once that entity or that organization notices your affiliation, then I think the discussion grows. Whereas if I sit there unknown as to my affiliation, that's where I think you have a conflict of interest that has not been disclosed, and that can create, I think, further issues down the line.
Got you.
Okay.
So listen, go ahead.
I think we have to remember that when we say conflict of interest, it's not an accusation. It doesn't imply that our judgment has been compromised. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a conflicting interest. The issue is how that is handled. That's the bottom line.
Okay.
I think that is very much that's the key. I think we have been taught that there is a conflict. I think that word is the trigger. So conflict means there's a fight,
bad.
there's something about to go down. we gonna
Shouldn't
make it
have
happen.
Shouldn't exist.
So I wanna ask this question: why should the church have a conflict of interest policy? Because we can't we all just get along? We're all getting to heaven. We're all reading from the same Bible, singing the same songs in the hymnal. Why we need a conflict of interest? We're all there for the church. Why should we have a conflict of interest policy?
You know that
Karnik?
statement. You know that statement that says, "To live with the saints above, oh, that will be glory. To live with the saints,
Yes.
well, that's another story."
All right. My.
And we have a
My goodness.
policy so that everybody understands what the rules are, what the game plan is. Because if you don't have a policy, they're going to say, "Well, nobody told me that. I didn't know that." Whereas if you have a policy, at least you could educate based on that policy, and everyone can understand where the limitations are, where the restrictions are, where the allowances are, and what their obligations are.
Okay. So I see Gene in the chat. I'm not going to speak directly to what he's saying, but he is talking about the conflict of interest document that we sign as denominational employees. But as a church member, even a church board, are we to be concerned about a conflict of interest policy? Should churches have conflict of interest policies, or accept what is handed down from the organization above?
Well, the North American division has a conflict of interest policy, and perhaps we can share the screen and I can go through it and then try to answer Gene's question. But
Okay.
the division working policy is in three parts. The first part talks about a conflict of interest, and it defines it as any circumstance where an employee or volunteer. So that covers all of us, whether we're employees,
Mm.
pastors, or we're volunteering at the local church or on an executive committee. By virtue of financial or other personal interest, may be influenced or appeared to be influenced by any motive or desire for personal gain, tangible or intangible. So here's the criteria. We're being motivated by a personal interest. So I'm appearing on this program today, and Roger, when we're done, I expect my $2,000 check because I'm appearing on this program, right? Well,
Hmm.
no,
Hmm.
what this policy says is I can't accept that gift because this is part of my job, part of my responsibility
Mm.
to educate. And I feel this is education. So for me to accept anything other than what the authorities define as a de minimis gift, gratuity, honorarium, and de minimis, the auditors have defined as being anywhere from $50 to $100. Anything
What?
beyond that is unacceptable. Now, if
Oh
I were
my.
working, if I were working for the federal government, or as Jason worked for the local government, I could not even accept a meal that somebody else was paying for.
Mm.
Why? Because there's
Mm.
that potential that I might be influenced by receiving that meal. I might be influenced to vote in a particular way, or for my judgment to be clouded by having accepted even something as small as a free meal. Now, the
Mm.
goes on. The second part of it talks about a conflict of commitment. We've talked about a conflict of interest. There's also a conflict of commitment. That is where our responsibilities as employees are affected by outside or other activity, other employment, so that it interferes with our responsibilities. In other words, my commitment is to my employer. As a pastor,
Hmm.
your commitment is to your employer. If you're going to carry on an activity that interferes with your responsibilities as a pastor, or if you take on, for example, a job that you work from midnight to 6 a.m., well, you say it's not office hours, it's outside my areas or my hours of responsibility. But if you're dead tired at 7 o'clock in the morning because you've worked all night and you can't carry out your responsibilities that you're paid for by your employer, that's a conflict of commitment. And so the policy says, no, you can't do that. That's a conflict. The third part of that policy then talks about the continuation of this conflict of commitment, where an employee
Mm.
functions or volunteer functions contrary to the values and ethical conduct that's outlined in the Statement of Ethical Foundations that was voted 24 years ago now by the General Conference Annual Council, that outlines what the values of the organizations are and what our responsibilities are as employees. The policy then goes on to give some examples of what conditions constitute a conflict. such as engaging in outside business or employment that encroaches on our call for full-time service, or engaging in a business with someone who is a supplier of goods and services to a denominational organization, accepting or offering gratuity or favor other than a de minimis value, or even using our connections within the organization, information that we receive because we happen to serve on the board of an organization to secure favors or employment for one of our family members. So whenever we use our position to further our own interests or to further the interests of one of our family members, the policy says that's a conflict of interest.
Mm.
I'd like to back up just a little bit because I got questions. Can we go back to the first slide? And I'm going to probably, I'm going to push some envelopes here. I hope you're ready, Karnik and Jason. I hope I don't throw you much. Okay, so when I read this statement, this sounds crazy to me. It sounds crazy because it just seems like it's like it seems like it could cover anything that you want it to cover, right? So let me give you an example. So it says conflict of interest shall mean any circumstance under which an employee or volunteer, by virtue of financial or other personal interest, present or potential, directly or indirectly, may be influenced or appear to be influenced for any other motive, et cetera, besides the well-being or other the success and the well-being of the denomination. That seems like, and help me out here, that sounds like if and as pastors, we get moved from district to district. If I keep my house, right, in the district, I don't sell the house, can't sell it, the house that I moved from, and I want to use that property, that home that I was in, as another income stream, right? I'm renting it out. That sounds like that creates a conflict of interest because that income, that tangible income that I'm getting has nothing to do with the success or the well-being of the denomination. And you could go on and on and on. The wording of this policy seems like it could apply to almost anything that I do, or what does it say? When that phrase, it says directly or indirectly. What does that mean? Does that mean if my wife has a house, or my wife has a different income, or my mother or my child or whatever? It seems like the way that this thing is worded, it seems like I could get a call, I could get a letter or whatever from HR or from whoever saying, Pastor, we heard that such and such is happening, and we want you to know that you are in violation of the conflict of interest policy because you did not report to us that you are renting a home. You didn't report to us that you have an investment in the stock market, that you don't have, etc. So help me out here. Is it intended to be that broad? Am I reading into it that it's not really that broad because I'm reading the language that it says, but it seems like it covers all of those things that I mentioned and 1,000 things more.
Can I jump in for a quick moment, Karnik?
Yeah, sure.
So first thing is, Pastor Wade, we need to have a discussion offline because you told me 1,600. But what I want to
He
do,
was not supposed to disclose that conflict.
and that goes right to my point. When I was working at the state, each year we had to do the financial disclosure forms or affidavits. And on those financial affidavits, we had to disclose property owned, we had to disclose financial interest, things of that nature as public servants. The challenge here, and I know that the quote is now removed from the actual screen, but it talks about shall have a conflict if these situations may occur, if they may, you may have a conflict if these things occur. The idea is, it's not that you would get a letter for having a conflict. The larger challenge is you receive a letter for not disclosing the potential conflict. And I use the word potential again, potential conflict. And I think we spoke about it earlier, having a body within that organization that will assess and analyze those conflicts of interest that have been revealed and disclosed, and from there give further direction on how to handle it moving forward. Now, you're absolutely right. But welcome, Pastor Paul, to Lawyering 101. The sheet needs to be the sheet needs to be as broad as possible to cover all as many instances as possible, because something could arise. And as you talk about the success of the denomination, that is a bit of a catch-all, Pastor Paul. I can agree with you in that regard, but it's there because there are times where there is direct opposition to the success of the denomination. And I believe that is what that policy is trying to deal with. So, but for me, it comes down to disclosure and then how we deal with that disclosure. So your instance, though, that's a great example. I love it. You have a home. You begin to rent the home. You don't see yourself as a real estate investor. You don't see yourself as now going into the landlord business, but you have a home, it's sitting vacant, and so you begin to rent the home. And somehow...
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, let me
He was
finish.
about to drop. He was about to drop
Okay.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And somehow you're
So Karnik, let me add something to that before you go on that. So here's I think the challenge is that, and I would love for our people in the chat to respond to my question, because here's the question: how many of our members, because that policy says for employees or volunteers, how many of our volunteers would feel comfortable or want to disclose all of that financial information to your church in order for you to serve as a volunteer at that church? That's why I have a problem with the wording of the because it just seems to do exactly what I'm saying right now. It seems like it would force our members to disclose that stuff.
Let me push back. How does
Yes.
that impact the success and well-being of the denomination? I think that's where the bottom line is. Is your rental going to cause a conflict because you're an employee? Well, it may, if all of a sudden your house keeps breaking down and you've got to drive 2 hours to fix a leaky toilet every week. It takes away from your other responsibilities. As far as a volunteer is concerned, no, they don't have to disclose that because their role is limited. It falls to the issue of what functions do I serve in my service to the local church board. When they complete the statement of acceptance of the conflict of interest, there is opportunity for them to disclose where they do have these conflicts. Some employers have said, as a general rule, that some things, even though they may be considered to be conflicts, we don't consider them to be conflicts. For example, you're paid as a pastor to preach sermons. Every week you write a sermon. At the end of the year, you've got 52 sermons. You call up Pacific Press and you say to Pacific Press, hey, I've got this great book. It's got 52 sermons. Wait a minute. You've already been paid to produce those sermons. But you're going to write a book now that you're going to get royalties on from Pacific Press. Well, your employer has said, as far as it relates to sermons, they're yours. Even though we paid you to write those sermons, we consider that to be yours. A lot of times when employees fill out conflict of interest forms, they'll start listing, for example, I have a membership with Marriott Hotels, or I have a membership with United Airlines. Why is that a conflict? Well, it's not. Your employer has said the points that you receive from frequent hotel or airline points, you're entitled to keep those. So that's not a conflict per se. Where it does become a conflict is when I fly United and I'm paying twice as much than I would have paid if I had flown Southwest. You see where it becomes a conflict? Because I'm looking to get my points on United, and so I have spent extra money of my employer rather than flying on a cheaper airline. So there are permissions that the employer has given that would have been conflicts, except for the fact that they've been waived by the employer.
Yeah, well, here's the pardon the pun, I can't resist it. Here's the conflict that I have with that, is that I don't see that which you just verbally articulated in the written policy. It's not there. what I see as the policy in print and on paper seems to cover any and everything, those things that I articulated. Something as simple as having a YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel. It said, can you put that back up for us, TJ? That the policy again, the first page. It says present, personal interest, present or potential. We are here on the Pastors Roundtable. We get to the point where we are monetized and there's money coming in and whatever. That's a financial potential for us right now. And that would suggest in writing that this is a conflict of interest.
That you have to disclose.
That I have to disclose. Right. And now we've disclosed we're actually streaming on our conference channel. So we know that is disclosed and everything, that we're aware of that. However, without the verbal, yes, this is okay. If I just come and read the policy suggests that something as simple as this is something that would stand in violation of this policy. And so I guess the conflict that I have is that this policy just seems to be so overarching. It encompasses anything that whoever is interpreting the policy wants it to cover.
But that's what Jason was saying earlier on. That is, you have to disclose. You have to disclose.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I think the key is
And Roger, most conferences are required to have committees in place to review these conflict of interest declarations. Determination whether or not your disclosure needs to be dealt with, whether or not they give you permission to continue with your conflict, or whether or not they tell you, sorry, this conflict cannot continue.
Okay.
Now again, I'm sorry. I got to push.
I think y'all are hitting it on the head, because we have focused more on the conflict than on the disclosure. We have spent more time dealing with trying to identify what the conflict is, as opposed to identifying the fact that we need to do the disclosure. And this idea of a disclosure committee, that's brand new to me.
Yeah, and Raj, if I could push, and I'm going to get out your way because I think you have the next thing that's coming up, and that is, again, I don't want to leave hanging out there. Again, based on the verbiage, the literal verbiage of the policy, it does not say that volunteers do not have to disclose to the same level as employees. Question is, should it say that? Or is that just an independent, arbitrary decision that is made by our different levels of the organization that govern this policy?
Well, I think if you look at the statement itself, that volunteers and employees have to sign the statement of acceptance. I don't know if we have a copy of that to put up. There are four aspects to it. Neither I nor my family has a financial interest or business relationship which competes with or conflicts with the interests of the employer. Number one. Number two, neither I nor my family have a financial interest in, nor am I or have been an employee, officer, director, or trustee, or receive financial benefits, directly or indirectly, from ownership in an entity that has been doing business in competition with my employer. 3, neither I or my family receive any payments or gifts, monetary or non-monetary, other than nominal value, from other denominational entities, suppliers, or agencies doing business with my employer.
And Elder, just for the layperson, they're not reading employer there; they're reading church or organization, right? Okay,
exactly, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And then finally, the last one: neither I nor my family serve or have served as an officer, director, trustee, or agent of any organization affiliated with or subsidiary to my employer or the church in a decision-making process involving financial or legal interests which advance my employer's interests. So there are very specific things that you have to disclose.
Okay.
So just a few things, and I know that we're trying to move on. It would behoove us in our local churches when providing that document to volunteers to have someone explain that document to them as well.
Yep.
Because, and obviously today is very helpful, but many have signed and moved on from those documents without fully appreciating what it is they're signing. And again, the idea that we're going through today, and I think we'll maybe touch on it a little bit later, there are two issues for me at the forefront of this discussion. The first one is a conflict of interest, and the second one is a conflict of commitment. And I think that the issue that we talked about, when you hear the word conflict, it automatically creates this sense of you're in breach. But I think that is probably more appropriate when dealing with a conflict of commitment. You start having to weigh, are you spending enough time? Are you performing your job duties, things of that nature? But the conflict of interest is perceived, is potential. It is as we would say, the appearance of impropriety, not necessarily impropriety, but perhaps the appearance of it, or a bias. And those things need to be analyzed and assessed and have some discussion. So there should be that body in place. I saw a question come up that someone asked, what happens once a disclosure has been made? And, it was addressed earlier that there should be a group that is reviewing and then calling into question, if need be, here are some concerns we have, or we have no concerns, we're signing off on this, we're moving forward.
Let me give you an example that occurs quite frequently at the local church. We're sitting around the table discussing a variety of different issues, and we need to get some work done at the church, whether it's to replace the roof, repave the parking lot, or you name it. One of our board members is sitting right there, and he's a contractor. He does concrete work, or he does paving work, and we all know that. And he says, "Hey, I can do it. I'll give you a price. I'll give you a fair price." And while the discussion is going on, he sits there and doesn't move. And meanwhile, we're all discussing whether or not we're going to hire this brother to do the work, or we just go ahead and do it without even testing the market by tendering the contract. Well, he has a conflict. We all know he has interest in this job. The first thing he should do is say, "You guys decide. I'm out of here. If you want me to do the job, here's what it's going to cost you," and remove himself from the discussion. By being in the room, he is able to influence. We're not going to take a decision against our brother if he's sitting in the room. He's also going to say, "I'm the best in the country. No, trust me, I'm going to do the work for you." And that's fine until we have a problem. So when we have members who have an interest in doing work for the church and they're sitting on the board, this policy says that they ought to remove themselves from the discussion. Don't vote. Don't be involved in that discussion. Otherwise, that's a conflict. And that's really
Wow.
where the frequency at the local church tends to be, is local church members being involved in a business that is going to provide a service, but yet they're in the room when the discussion is taking place. The rest of the group feels somewhat confined because he's in the room and they can't be honest in taking the action. And so that's how that conflict arises.
Listen, you just brought up
Yeah.
something. I know we got to go to break, but you just brought up something. In our church, in our conference levels, our presidents are the chairman of the board, and they are the chairman of the executive committee. And yet still, everything that happens at the executive committee, it's referenced back to their leadership or what they're doing, the treasurer, the secretary,
Ooh,
and
Roger.
they're in the room. They're in the room while we're discussing all of that. What you just shared with me kind of puts a light on the fact that that's a conflict of interest in even how we operate our executive committees. Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I
If
reading
my
that right
president
or
is
wrong?
watching, I had no conference with Roger on this question. I had nothing to do with it.
Roger, you're absolutely right, except for this.
Come on.
The denomination has said that on the ecclesiastical side of the church, that is acceptable, except where the president is so involved or ingrained in the issue that's being discussed that he can't remove himself from being a fair chairman. At that point, he needs to step aside as any other member would. And if he wants to discuss an issue, he goes to the floor and discusses it from the floor, not as the chair. Where it is different is on the institutional side. On the institutional side, whether it's on colleges, universities, publishing houses, the only member of the executive team that sits on the board of that organization is the president of the organization. Nobody else from the employee side sits on the board. On the ecclesiastical side, president, secretary, treasurer, departmental directors, a number of individuals, pastors, teachers, sit on the executive committee. So we have accepted that practice on the ecclesiastical side and say, even though there is a potential conflict, we've agreed that as far as our ecclesiastical operation, that is acceptable, except where the individual is so involved in the issue being discussed that he has to recuse himself from the position of chair and argue whatever his position is as a regular member.
So that's a very interesting assessment that person has to do of themselves, right? So you're asking those individuals who are ingrained, it means something to them, they're knee deep in it, chest deep in it, if you will, to say, I'll step out of it. And you guys decide what is best. And I think that for me is the problem on a lot of different levels. I'm going to go back to the local example that Karnik raised earlier. Excellent example, because I've seen it, I've lived it. And one of the issues we have is not so much that the brother or the sister won't get up and say, I'll excuse myself, but you have the rest of the board saying, well, we know that, Brother Karnik would never, overcharge us. We know that Brother Karnik would do us in a bet. He's been here since 1812, and so it's just one of those. I'm not suggesting you're that old. By any means, you look a day over 30. Okay. But at the end of the day, we are oftentimes we box ourselves in and we create the conflict ourselves without the individual even having an opportunity to step out and to have something vetted properly. And then on the next level, I've sat on the building committee as well. And we have had individuals who are involved in projects that are coming before the building committee. And those individuals who are sitting there, whether it be general contractors or whatever services they're providing on those specific projects. And the idea is, it's a good thing we have brother so-and-so who's doing this or sister so-and-so who's doing that, because they were able to help save this project. And so again, there's a conflict there because there is a pecuniary interest in that particular project. And I think that it has to go beyond the chair of that committee. There needs to be some analysis in a body that can come back and say, you know what, maybe it's best if you push this person, have a bit of a Chinese wall here between them and this particular project, if they're the ones who are going to be benefiting from it at the end of the day.
And there's more than community interest as well. What happens if there's a problem down the road in the quality of the work? Are you going to sue your brother? So you have to take all that into account and understand that if we take this person on and he's going to do the work for us, if there's a problem, we've got to keep our mouth shut.
He's not my brother, he's my cousin. So
he ain't heavy.
Listen, we're gonna ask you to just sit tight 1 second. We're gonna ask our viewers to just hold on. We're gonna take a quick break and come right back into this conversation. I think I dropped a little bomb there, Pastor Paul.
Yeah. Hey, listen, I am so glad, Pastor Wade, that our guests have been willing to come today. This is it's a great conversation that I think that we are all learning through. And if you are just joining us, we have with us today Karnik, Doukmetzian, I hope I got it closer that time, Jason Tracey, both of them lawyers. Karnik is the general counsel for the General Conference, as well as serving the NAD in that same capacity. We're talking today about conflict of interest policies that are relevant both to what we've learned today, both to employees of the church as well as to volunteers. We spent the first half of our conversation today speaking mostly about how it applies to volunteers. I think in the next segment, we're going to begin moving into how it impacts at least some of our employees as well. But if you've got anybody who's had any question about this, if you've had issue in your church, had issue on your church board or at your conference level, and you want to hear from the sources, people who are actually legal minds, legal counsels, then you want to make sure you take the opportunity now to invite them to the second part of our conversation today. Again, Roger, we want to welcome folk to Pastors Roundtable today. If they are just joining us, tell us just a little bit more about how people can find out more about not just this episode of the Pastors Roundtable, but about previous episodes of the Pastors Roundtable.
Listen, as you can tell, we don't hold back. We try to get the information that's relevant, resource, and real you there. You can go to our website, theprt.live. You will have every episode that we have had since season 1 available to you. You can watch, you can learn. We have talked about topics that dealt with structure, topics that dealt with ministry. We have talked about our church opportunities, rights that you have as a member, how to connect with these things. We have gone the gamut, and today is just one more opportunity you are finding out on how to operate within the Seventh-day Adventist Church particularly, but any church that has some kind of governance. This information is very relevant.
All right. Again, we invite you to invite some. Dr. Henry is not with us today. For those of you that join us late, you know that there's normally 3 hosts. Dr. Henry is celebrating his 25th wedding anniversary, traipsing around somewhere on the planet, somewhere off the continent, somewhere. But we wish him well. But he normally at this spot does what, Pastor Wade? He's asking folk to do what right now?
He's asking them to share, and share, whether you're on Facebook, on YouTube, like and subscribe. You want to make sure that you're getting all of the information about Pastors Roundtable so that you can be relevant, resourced, and real.
That's right. So we want you to go ahead and share the stream. If you're on Facebook, and listen, just interacting with the stream, and you type a question, you hit that thumbs up button on Facebook. Even if you hit the thumbs down on YouTube, that helps. So just help us out. Make sure that you interact with the feed, that you share it with somebody, and we'll be grateful for your participation in that. Are we ready to bring our guest back and hit this second leg?
Yes, all right. We are ready to go. Thank you for taking a breath. I know you probably got a drink of water. You're ready to go. But before we jump into the next question, Pastor Paul, I noticed that Stephanie Scott, who is part of our team and also one of our authors on our comments, she asked this question: can policy be made that organizations have a disclosure committee? Because as you were sharing it, Karnik, that is not something we see in the document.
No, but it is in the policy. The North American Division policy has a requirement that organizations, conferences, unions have a review committee that reviews the conflict of interest form once it's filed. So can a church have something like that? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay.
A little historical context. We talk about this conflict of interest policy and how it came about. It really got going back in the early 1980s when the church in North America got into significant financial difficulties because of a pyramid scheme that a particular individual started promoting, that pastors and church leaders became involved with. They started associating their name with the scheme. They benefited personally. And in the end, the church lost significant amounts of money that were invested with this individual that eventually were lost. So the policy came out as a result of this particular series of incidents. But it seems over time, 40 years have now passed, we don't learn very much, because I keep seeing this repeated over and over again, where our pastors use their position, or our church members use their positions to endorse or promote a business of our family members or somebody else, and we're getting a little kickback on the side because somebody's investing their money into this pyramid scheme, as we've recently seen in some of our churches. So 40 years have passed, but we haven't learned that we shouldn't be using our position to endorse
Mm,
or promote a particular business that may end up hurting our church.
Yeah, I
mm,
think, Karnik, that's a great point to highlight, and I don't want us to fly by it. Is that the policy, just giving us the history on the policy makes it sound like this is not just a policy that is designed to protect the structure or the company of the church, the legal structure, but it's also, it sounds like, was designed to help protect members as well. The individual, not just the corporate entity, but also it is something that helps protect individuals from things like what you just described to us. And I think that's an important point, I think, for our audience to make sure that we understand that part as well.
Yep.
So I'm glad you brought that up, Karnik. I mean, just over a month ago, we saw that happen again. So the reference to the historical point, it happens again here in South Florida, where there's a lawsuit filed, federal lawsuit, and it names again denominational workers in that lawsuit as it relates to that type of fraud scheme that was taking place. So I think if we could, and I saw someone brought a comment up saying it shouldn't be that hard to have these conversations with our members, right? As it relates to conflict of interest, step out of the meeting, or you need to disclose, whatever it may be. And I think if we can continue to keep our eye fixed on the reasoning and the rationale behind why we're doing what we do, as opposed to just fill out this form, turn it in, the conference needs it. I think that type of just teaching moment and equipping individuals with information will serve us much better and much longer and help us to avoid some of these pitfalls that come up along the way.
Absolutely.
Oh, did we lose Anselm? Oh, there he is. Okay, awesome, awesome. So Anselm, you have the green light.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So green light. Let me find where we are here. All right. So here's our next question, guys. And I want to direct this one again to start off anyway with Elder Tracey. Actually, I if I may redirect, I'd like to redirect this to the denominational guy. Can someone be dismissed from employment if they are in breach of the conflict of interest policy? Is this something that is this a hey, stop doing that, or is this is termination a part of the thing there? And do we have any examples of conflict of interest situations that can cause a termination for employment? So I know we can't fire our members. I know there are many pastors who wish they could fire some members or move them, relocate them. We can't do that on the lay level, but so as far as the volunteers, but as it pertains to employees, are there situations where we can terminate employees based on a breach of the policy? And what are some of the types of things that would start that or instigate that?
Sure. If I can go back to the North American Division Working Policy, it says that there's a section entitled Sanctions for Noncompliance. And noncompliance includes a failure to comply with the policy, accurately reporting disclosures on the form, or complying with decisions that the organization makes, the employer makes. And that could result up to and including termination from employment. So obviously, the initial instance when the conflict is brought to the employer's attention may not be termination. It may be, hey, this is a conflict. You need to stop doing it. But if the employee refuses to comply, refuses to follow the direction of the employer, it could lead to termination. And as far as volunteers, if they are in a conflict, they too could be warned and then, if necessary, removed from their volunteering position, from their service on a particular board. So there are provisions, there are sanctions, but the intent here is not to come down with the hammer, but to make the employee or volunteer understand what the issue is and bring them into compliance, into disclosure, into avoiding the conflict that brought a rise to the issue.
Okay.
Okay.
Elder Tracey, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Roger.
No, I was gonna pitch punt it over to Elder Tracey there.
Yeah.
From your perspective of the same question, can someone be dismissed?
So again, referring back to the policy, I won't go back over that. Karnik obviously knows it a lot better than I do as it relates to the local policy. But I will say this, I continue to say it. The conflict of interest is about notice and disclosure. Once that's handed over, it's up to the denomination, that committee, that delegation of individuals to make an assessment as to what next steps should be taken. The conflict of commitment, however, I think that speaks to issues that you're not fulfilling your duties under your employment agreement, and then next steps can be taken as it relates to that disciplinary track, depending on how that is handled through HR. Going back to the conflict of interest, however, let's say, for example, Pastor Paul, Pastor Wade, and Pastor Henry disclose that they have a YouTube channel that they dedicate time to every other week or so, and they discuss issues relevant to our membership. Okay, not in competing. It happens off of the pulpit hours and all that other good stuff. Then all of a sudden they hit 10 million subscribers, and now YouTube
Come
says
on,
we want
speaking into
to
existence.
Share. Let me stop.
Correct, exactly. And so, not to be funny, but when you said that during the commercial break, Pastor Wade, I thought to myself, that's disclosure. That's putting everyone on notice, right? Share, right? And in that moment, if you begin to now generate a financial, I won't say benefit, because it won't be a financial benefit to you. I think you guys are going to pour it all back into some aspect of ministry, but you begin to generate financial proceeds from that venture or from this venture. Do you now need to go back and update your conflict of interest form and say, we have a YouTube channel that's actually lucrative now? And I guess my point is, if the conference or your employer is on notice, what steps or what extra steps need to be taken after that point? Because in my view, I've put you on notice, I've disclosed it, and I'm done. So whether that be in 2014 when we began or now 2023, how often, and I don't know how they do it with employees, but how often does that have to be updated? And that's already been disclosed. And so I think there's a little bit of a rub as it relates to what can be done. Can termination come about? I think the termination discussion for me for conflict of interest comes when there's a failure to disclose. It came to light, we're having a discussion, and it rises to that level, whether it be some type of disciplinary action, corrective action, or termination. And I see that very differently from the conflict of commitment aspect of it. So again, notice, I think, is a huge piece.
And I just want to make just a little apology, because I know we had just read, Karnik, the conflict of commitment statement, and I threw us back into the conflict, that first paragraph, the definition of conflict of interest. So we didn't really get to drill into the conflict of commitment statement, which was where we were when I kind of kicked us back there. So it might be, Roger, it might be of value to go back and now to spend some time, really, because I see Elder Tracey has some interest in dealing with the conflict of commitment statement there.
I have to be honest. After 20-something years in ministry, it's only within, I've signed a conflict of interest statement, but I've not really, have the conversation about the conflict of commitment statement. And basically how most conferences deal with the conflict of commitment statement is you just can't have a second job, period. That's it. There's nothing around it. It's just been simply, you can't have a second job. And what I'm learning today is that there are some nuances to that may impact how we sign this conflict of interest, conflict of commitment statement moving forward.
Well, I would suggest as we just move into this discussion, and I just want to, we talk about in PRT being relevant, resourced, and real, and this is a huge point of conversation and even contention and conflict with employees of the church, and it pertains to what's the word that I'm looking for? The consistency of how we apply the policy. And the ambiguity that exists in the language of the policy to begin with. So it has, and I've seen this, it has everybody trying to figure out, everybody's a pejorative term, I get that. A lot of people trying to figure out, well, is what I'm doing a conflict, and am I up to be fired because if my rental comes to light, or if there's an issue, and whereas what was the committee, the conflict committee, one conflict committee says, okay, well, this rental property is not an issue, but yeah, he's also I don't know, he's a musician, and so he's going into the studio and he's making CDs, and or she's selling them and making a whole lot of money on that. This employee is being paid to pastor a church, but they're also being paid by an educational institution to teach a few hours a week. Here's one who's being paid by the conference, but they're being paid as well to be a chaplain in one of our own hospitals. Or here's one who's being paid to pastor a church, but they're taking 2-3 months out of the year, or weeks out of the year, to go and work in the military as a chaplain. You've got all of these things that exist that seem like, oh, okay, well, what I'm doing is pretty much the same thing as they're doing, and so I should be safe. And then you start hearing some of conversations like this, and you start wondering, oh, well, maybe I'm not. And so I think that, how do we speak to the fear that, I know we said, Elder Tracey, you've talked about disclosure. As long as you disclose, then you should be safe. I'm not so sure. I'm saying, once we go beyond the disclosure, and you've got one entity here that interprets your situation as being a conflict in this part of the organization, and we understand that conferences hire and fire when we're talking about that, as far as the employees there. So if one conference interprets, or one of these committees that we talked about that are set up, they interpret this thing to be a conflict over here, somebody else in another conference, a different committee, is reviewing the same disclosure, and they determine that their disclosure is not a conflict. And so there's no request made of the employee, and they're just fine, and they just keep doing, where the other one is asked to cease and desist, or whatever it is, and that their employment now becomes weighed in the balances. How do we address that when we have a structure that is weird, in that policy is made at the division, but it's executed in all of these different parts as far as our conferences are concerned? I don't know how you see that, Elder Tracey, as a legal lay person, and then Karnik as part of the denominational structure that deals with the interpretation and the development of the policies. Let's start with Karnik, and then we'll go to. Let's start with Jason, and then we'll go to Karnik.
I'll say this, and this is just based upon past work experience. I see it as a lawsuit. So, plain and simple terms, you have one policy, and then you have this, because you made some very good points, and I was going to speak to it earlier as well. You have individuals who are part of perhaps the Coast Guard, and every couple of, maybe a weekend a month, or a weekend every 2 months, they have to go out and serve in the military. Well, that's taking away from the commitment you have to your job with the local conference. Pastor Wade had a very good point earlier. He said, as far as I knew, you just couldn't have a second job. And it was just a blanket understanding for him. So he kind of operated in that vein. And then meanwhile, there are some cutouts, right? There are some, you kind of carve out this exception for chaplaincy. And okay, but I'm working with the Adventist health system, so maybe that works there. Well, what if I'm working for a private institution or another type of medical facility that has nothing to do with our denomination? Does that still fit? And so there are all these situations that arise. And for me, it spells similarly situated as my comparators. And I start looking at those comparators and start asking the question as to whether I'm being treated differently on the basis of whatever those protected instances are than my counterpart. I would be careful that if we are going to go down this road and say there is a conflict of interest or a conflict of commitment, and I'm going to try and use that as the basis and use those as the guideposts to say your employment is now in jeopardy, and or you're going to be, whether it be disciplined, whatever it may be, then I need to make sure I can do that across the board. And if at any point I have to stop and I go across the board, I need to reevaluate how I'm applying, how I'm implementing these things. And for me, it goes back to the same instance as it relates to the chairperson of those different committees or boards who's able to get up and say, I can't serve as a chairperson because I have such a vested interest in the outcome, it wouldn't be fair. Or I have a perceived vested interest in the outcome, and it wouldn't be fair for me to sit on this committee. And so that comes to the place where we start looking at the aspect of how heavy in your life is your Christianity, where you can actually make those assessments
Wow.
and ask the Holy Spirit if you're doing what should be done, because a document alone won't guide you. It's going to be something
Wow.
deeper than that.
Wow.
Okay.
Attorney
Karnik.
Karnik?
Well, I think we have to remember that we don't have one employer in the United States. We are many employers.
Mm-hmm.
And different conferences may have different ways of handling a report of conflict of interest. The policy is there to provide the ground rules on, and how they interpret those ground rules will be different from conference to conference, from employer to employer. So your employer in one conference may deal differently with that conflict, may understand it differently and make allowances, whereas another conference may take a harder line position or not as stringent a position. But it really is an employer by employer evaluation. And as long as the employer is consistent with how it determines and evaluates and deals with that conflict, I think the employer is going to be fine. I don't think we can compare conferences from one end of the country to the other and how they're dealing with their employees. We really have to look at how the particular employer is dealing with it. And as long as they have the rules, for example, there are some employers that say, if you're gonna do outside employment, whether that is writing books or editing manuscripts or doing musical jam sessions, as long as your remuneration doesn't exceed X number of dollars, then it's okay. So they've made their own ground rules that they apply to their employees. I think the bottom line we need to remember in all of this, on the question of commitment, is, does it interfere with the performance of the employee's duties? That's the issue that the employer has to consider in each and every instance. Does it interfere with the function and the responsibilities of that the employee is assigned to and is being compensated for?
Yeah, well, that's good.
Wow.
I'm looking at our time. We've got just a few minutes left, Roger, and we kind of rushed by one of the questions that I saw in the chat. I don't remember who put it up there, and my apologies to our audience. I'm in my situation, I cannot see any of your comments right now, but it had to do with, and this is something I'm trying to figure out. If I ask this question, is this question like asking, somebody mentioned this to me the other day, you know how you come to class and the teacher has promised you a test and you get through the whole class period and the teacher hasn't given you a test, and there's that one kid who raises their hand and said, we're supposed to have a test. I feel like that kid right now.
You are that man, Pastor Paul?
I never was before, but I think I'm about to be. But there was that, I didn't ask it, I'm repeating it. The question about gifts. Somebody said about something like pastors receiving gifts. I know that most of our employees in the Seventh-day Adventist Church now are not pastors. They are not people who stand behind the desk, but people who a pulpit, but who sit behind a desk. So we have that. But if we're talking about pastors, a lot of times you go to a school and you do a graduation, or you go to a church, and I know plenty of friends who have said they've done a week of prayer, and the church wanted to say thank you. Not only did they put a honorarium in their hand, but they bought them a set of golf clubs. Or the church wants to send the pastor and his wife on a honeymoon, not a honeymoon, or what do you call it, an anniversary trip. I do not believe that's what happened with Dr. Henry. So y'all don't. That's not his situation.
Hey.
But yeah, church is gonna come up with $4,000 or $5,000 to send pastor and his wife on an anniversary trip or whatever. Oh, and look, there's the time, ladies and gentlemen. Those are things I almost don't want to hear the answer to the question, but I know that, again, it differs from place to place. So in the 30 seconds that we have left, any
but
guidance?
before we jump to that portion of it, I want to believe that honorariums and gifts is a different topic from conflict of interest.
Well, that was the question that was in the chat. The question that was in the chat was, do these constitute conflict of interest? And again, if we say we're going to be relevant, resourced, and real in the 15 seconds now that we have left, I'm glad I left this one to the last. Well, but look, any thoughts from either of you on that?
Let me jump in, because that form that you sign every single year says neither I nor my family have received any payments or gifts, monetary or non-monetary, other than of nominal value. Well, you sign that form every year. What is nominal value? You ask the IRS, they say $100. You ask GCAS, they say $100. You ask North American Division, they may say $200. What is nominal value? It means minimal, de minimis, small. $5,000 to me is not minimal.
Does the policy give any directive as to who interprets the term nominal?
The policy does not, but the North American Division has released guidance on what, and the auditors, GCAS auditors, have also released guidance on what that term nominal means. Mm-hmm. Anyways, that's a long topic for another paper.
Yes.
Let me just summarize in 4 bullet points the 4 basic rules. You define the conflict. We talk about the policy. We circulate the policy. We educate on the policy. For the individuals, by submitting that annual form. They declare if there is a conflict. For the organization, they make a determination when a conflict of interest is present. They get to decide. But finally, and at the end, we have to document. It's not just enough to do the first 3, but we have to document. Because if a person does disclose that they have a conflict and it's not recorded anywhere, when the issue comes up, how do they defend themselves that say, yeah, I raised that issue. Don't come to me now. So always make sure that that is documented. When a person declares a conflict and leaves the discussion on a board, make sure that's documented in the minutes so that the minutes reflect John Doe left the discussion, so that the minutes don't reflect that, well, we don't know what happened to John. He was supposed to be here. He's here. The minutes say he was here, but yet, we were dealing with his conflict. So document is also very important.
Good.
Gotcha. Good stuff.
Yeah. Well, let me say my say then, and I'll kick it to you, Raj, and let you kind of wrap us up. Just again, a very special thank you to both of our guests today. We always enjoy having you both on the Pastors Roundtable, at the Pastors Roundtable. I believe that our audience has had, somebody said, can the pastors unionize? I believe that this has been a good introduction to those of our audience who may not have been familiar with it. And so it kind of whets the intellectual appetite to try to figure out some of these things. I think some, particularly in our local church, have learned some things about conflict of interest and how it works at the local level. Again, thank you both so much for the time that you spent dealing with us with this topic today. I have issues still with the wording of the policy. I will send my edits to you, Karnik. But I think it would be, I would be very interested to hear, once our audience gets to hear or spend some time, I would love to hear some of your feedback, because again, as a pastor, when I have this document to give to my members or to my board members and say, you've got to sign this, I've never had any success whatsoever with that. It would be and partially because I did not know some of the stuff that I learned today. And so that was hugely helpful to me in being able to now stand in front of my folk and say, yes, here's some of the rationale. This is what this means. So again, this has been very valuable information today. Thank you so much for both Karnik and Jason. Jason, I will not say your last name since I can't say the other one either. But again, on my behalf, on behalf of Dr. Henry, thank you so much. Roger, you can take us out, Doc.
Listen, I want to add my congratulations and thanks for what I learned today. And I know so many others in the chat. I believe those who'll be watching this in the replay are going to have questions, add things. You have been, I can't even put a term on it, for what you have done for our church today in sharing this information, the
Huge.
perspective, and the information that has been here. So thank you so much for being a part of that. To our viewers who have watched, please again share. I may be in conflict here, but share this show with those who need to understand what's happening and what's going on. As you hear things happening in our church, you will actually begin to be able to speak intelligently as to how things should be dealt with. And I thank these two gentlemen, these two lawyers, for their insight into what we have heard today. So, on behalf of our team in the background, TJ and Stephanie and
DJ,
John,
Steph,
and
John.
we thank you. We're not going to thank you on behalf of Dr. Henry. He's enjoying himself a bit too much today. We're going to hear the stories later on, but we're just so glad that he actually had part in preparing us for this show. We all here, the Pastors Roundtable, are excited to partner with you as a team. Now, I just saw the email. I just saw the text. We want to remind you that for the next couple of weeks, we will not have a show because of camp
Wow.
meeting schedules. So we are going to take a quick break. We'll be back in July because right now, camp meeting is going to take precedent, and we do not want to be in conflict. I'm putting my new knowledge to work here. We don't want to be in conflict.
Last camp meeting, my president was with us on the Pastors Roundtable during camp meeting. So we were not in conflict.
That's right. But this year, yeah, that's last time. But this time we want to make sure that we are not in conflict. So thank you again for being a part of Pastors Roundtable today, where we strive to make ministry relevant,
resourced,
and real.